Welcome everyone. Um, my name is Swanzil and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. Today we have with us Dr. Malika Chatterjee. She is currently an assistant professor at Amity University, Noida, and has also worked with the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. She has completed her bachelor's in human physiology from Presidency College, master's in genetics from University of Calcutta, and PhD in genetics from the University of Connecticut Health Center. Her major academic interests include clinical neurobiological research and mammalian neurodevelopment. She is highly skilled in her field and is well versed with techniques like fluorescence correlation spectroscopy, microinjection, confocal microscopy, molecular cloning, chicken electroporation, and many more. Dr. Chatterjee is here with us today to deliver an intriguing webinar on the tale of sugar-coated neurons. Welcome, ma'am, and I would like to hand over the space.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me a nice introduction and welcome. I will present a story, certainly, about the sugar-coated neurons. But before that, I really want to do a little bit of neuroanatomy, as I realize that there are a couple of people here who might not be well versed with the terms that we typically use in defining certain areas of the brain. And the first slides that you will see will actually talk about neuroanatomy and just an endeavor to understand what the various parts of the brain are and what are the various terms or connotations that are used in this regard. Again, please ask me if you have any questions. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about, as my story will be about, heparin sulfates. Heparin sulfate proteoglycans are actually the sugars that was listed in my, in my title. These are the sugars which are present on the surface of the neurons, the millions of cells that make up our brain. Okay. Now, if we talk about the brain, you'll be surprised, and of course, you all know that we do various functions, like we do like hundreds of different types of functions in a day. And therefore, the brain is capable of doing diverse activities. But interestingly, this brain didn't begin during, when we are conceived, when we are born, our brain is not as complex as it becomes later. Initially, it begins from a simple tube, which is called the neural tube. Like imagine a tube which is surrounded by nothing but a similar looking group of cells. Those are the neural cells. And those neural cells are the ones which will become various types of, like say 100 types of different cells, and each cell will have its own function. And at the end of the day, that is what gives rise to the diversity of our brain. The difference, the huge difference in the different cell types, the huge functional difference in the various cell types that are found within the brain in an adult. But when we start off, we are going to talk about that stage that is called developmental neurobiology, and that is my area of interest. So as I said, the neural, the embryo, at the initial very early stages, like few days after conception in the human, it looks like this, this is the front part, which is also called the anterior, and this is called the posterior. The back part is called the posterior, and it's in the middle of this, as you see a weird, butterfly shaped, or rather a heart shaped opening. This is the place which will form the brain, and this place which is at the bottom is the one which will form the other parts other than, like the cerebellum, spinal cord, etc. Now if you cut through this, chop through that, there are various regions that you will see here. What are the regions? That is shown by 1, 2, and 3 on the right side. Okay. And if you notice here, there is this structure, this purple structure is nothing but a layer of cells. And this layer of cells is called the neural plate. What does the neural plate do? This group of cells pushes inside and forms a vessel-like structure in the second part, which is called the neural fold. Then it pinches off from the top and forms the tube. So this is how the neural tube is formed. And this purple area that you see here is called the neural tube, which is nothing but a group of cells. Look at it, the same figure here. This is the neural tube here, surrounded by a group of cells. And this purple area, now so far undifferentiated, that is, they are all of the same type. They will now form a lot of convolutions or vesicles. And in this early stage, these are called bulges. As you see, they are like balloons. These are bulges, which is nothing but filled with what? Cerebrospinal fluid on the inside, and on the outside, they are lined by a shingle sheet of neural cells. The areas are color-coded. The blue area is called prosencephalon, green area is called mesencephalon, and the bottom part is called rhombencephalon. Now, the prosencephalon further changes by a lot of cell migration happens, and two bulges are further created in the anterior part, which is called the telencephalon. Next to the telencephalon, the prosencephalon forms another structure called the diencephalon. From there, mesencephalon doesn't divide. From here, it's still called the mesencephalon. The rhombencephalon becomes the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. Note that this blue area, light blue area, is one which will occupy most of the volume of the brain of an adult. So the telencephalon is what is composed of the what is called the forebrain. And you might all know that the forebrain is called what? The forebrain has those structures which is called the cerebral hemisphere. There are two cerebral hemispheres, okay? And these two are considered as the highest seat of cognition, okay? So the highest seat of cognition, why? Because this is the part which developed most in the human being, even more than the other non-human primates. Okay, so this part, this blue part, is called the forebrain, and which can be seen in the adult structure here that you see. This entire blue part is shown in the adult as brown. This is called the forebrain. Beneath that is called the diencephalon. Then you have the midbrain, pons, medulla, which form together the brainstem, and you have the cerebellum. Cerebellum helps in movement. Mind you, these are all groups of cells, mostly composed of neurons. These cells are what? They are neurons. Okay. And finally, you get the spinal cord here. The forebrain, the diencephalon, the brainstem is together called the brain. And the brain and the spinal cord make up what? They make up the central nervous system. As I said, just to revise, this neural tube is divided into prosen, mesen, and rhombencephalon. Prosencephalon can be divided into telen and diencephalon, and the mesencephalon remains the mesencephalon. Rhombencephalon further divides into meten and myelin. And in the adult, what structures do you see? You see the cerebral hemisphere. The thalamus, hypothalamus, and subthalamus are substructures which come out of the diencephalon. Mesencephalon develops into the midbrain, meten becomes the pons and the cerebellum, and myelencephalon becomes the medulla. Now, why are these structures named differently? Because each of them have unique functions which they perform in the adult. Okay, so this is the division of the central nervous system. Now, the other part of neuroanatomy which is important is that there are certain planes of orientation. We cut the brains in different ways. One way of cutting it, this is the adult brain. One way of cutting it is the horizontal. This red line shows the coronal way of cutting, or the coronal plane of section. And sagittal is just cutting through the cerebral hemispheres along the axis where the cerebral hemispheres can be divided. Now, many of you might have undergone an MRI or an fMRI, and you can see and recognize these sections as coronal. This is the coronal section. If you cut it like this, its horizontal representation is like this, and the sagittal representation is like this. So whenever we refer to as coronal, horizontal, or sagittal, in fact, in humans, it's also called frontal. So therefore, you will always immediately know it's a universal way of naming them and which structures they are. Okay, and which way the brain has been cut.
Ma'am?
So now if you, yes.
In the previous slide, in the
yes.
third slide.
Yes.
So so all this division, so are we able to understand it from evolutionary perspective, so that how these divisions happened, like in specific come from cells, so how that from evolutionary perspective it developed in such a way?
Yes. So see, evolution is always looking at the existing animals, right? So looking at the existing animals or looking at fossils, there are two ways of looking at it. So people have compared, for example, the sizes of the respective structures and seen that at what extent or what proportion of the whole brain do they exist. And therefore, they have come up with the idea that, say, for example, which we know a lot, and I'm going to show you some examples here, that in the telencephalon is in fact the area where the most evolution has taken place. They are the newer formed structures, the telencephalon, that is the cerebral hemisphere. Compared to that, you will know the hypothalamus, subthalamus, midbrain, cerebellum. These are earlier developed structures, okay, in evolution. And people have, of course, evidence kya hai? People have looked at the existing species or in fossils and have calculated the relative size of the various subparts. That's it. Or looked at gene expression in those areas. And if gene expression, that means, say, gene A is expressed in the midbrain of, say, the bird, and it is involved in some function, like its protein, helps in forming direction sensing cells, in the bird, in the midbrain. So similarly, it does the same in the mammal, some kind of, mammal. So that means that structure has been formed as early as the bird, and therefore that gene expression is conserved and the function is also conserved. Sometimes it happens that gene expression might be there, but the function of it making the flying sensing, for example, in the bird, is no longer functional in the human, even though the gene is still there. That happens. The gene becomes silent. Okay. Yeah. So there are two things. One is gene expression. The other is by comparing the different sizes of the structures, they can understand. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. All right. So a little bit more, like a bit of details about the horizontal and the coronal section, so that you know a little bit about, neuroscience per se. And when you look at, sections of these brains, sometime, somewhere you can Google also and see brain sections. So there is one very interesting thing that happens in the cortex. So this is the cortex. This is the cerebral hemisphere or the cortex, cerebral cortex, used interchangeably, the terms. All right. So now if you section it coronally, for the cortex, these folds. Okay. So these folds are very specific for primates. A mouse is a mammal, but a mouse doesn't have such folds. And animals which do not have such folds are called lissencephalic. And animals which have this fold, like us, we are called gyrencephalic. And one of the theories is that the increase in the gyri was done, increase in the convolutions was done in order to accommodate more number of cells, where in the gray matter area that you see here. So this gray matter area is what? It's nothing but the cell bodies. So in this case, we are speaking about neurons, and the neurons will have a cell body, and they also have processes. Why? Because they come through the processes, they communicate with other neurons. They travel to other places via formation of, like expressways. Those are called tracts. And the area where the tracks go through is called the white matter. But the area where the cell bodies are located or garaged is called the gray matter. So in the cortex context, the gray matter is located on the outside, on the rim, and white matter or the processes are located on the inside. So the white matter, why is it white? Because they look very shiny. When you look at an unstained brain section under the microscope, they look shiny. Why does it look shiny? Because it has a layer of phospholipid, which is called the myelin sheath, and myelin is used for fast conduction. Therefore, the importance of myelin. Fast conduction of what? Of nerve impulses, that is information traveling from one neuron to the other. Okay. So myelin is again an evolutionary significance. As you know, like as humans, we actually have more myelinated processes as compared to, say, a mouse, So there are various aspects which makes us more evolved, but myelination is one of them. So the gray matter is there and then the white matter. But if you look at a section of the spinal cord, what you see is the gray matter is on the inside in a shape of almost like a butterfly, and the white matter is on the outside. So that difference, And if you look at a horizontal section, you see certain interesting structures. These dark areas are called the subcortical structures or deep nuclei, which are present within the brain or within the forebrain. They are located deep, but they are still consisting of cell bodies. And one very interesting thing about neurosciences here is the terms. As I said, nuclei is nothing but a group of cell bodies. It's not the nuclei of a cell. Like in biology, normally we say that. But nuclei in neuroanatomy means it's a collection of cell bodies. Okay. So that you see a lot of collection or aggregates of particular cell bodies of various structures within this whole white matter area. So they are not white matter, they are gray matter because they are collection of cell bodies. So these are the various interesting things about the brain. Now, we are all interested in evolution and cognition, how are we more intelligent than other species? And in order to understand that, we should sort of understand what are the various areas of the most important cognitively involved structure, which is the cerebral cortex. So when we look at it, this is a very much layman neuroanatomy book example, where this is the frontal lobe. It's divided into lobes. The cerebral cortex is the frontal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, this is the occipital, and this is the temporal lobe. And this is a side view or the lateral view of the cerebral hemisphere. So this area is the one which has all the interesting things because it is an extremely complex information processing area. Why? Because this receives basic information from the parietal lobe, from the occipital lobe, from the temporal lobe, and processes complex information related to things like attention, memory, memory storage, long-term memory storage, and etc. And all this together contributes to what we call cognition. Okay. And decision-making, planning, decision-making, all this happens in the frontal lobe. And frontal lobe, mind you, cannot function in isolation. It functions with the help of inputs from these other areas of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so that's the interesting part. Now, we're talking about cell bodies. So what communicates between one lobe to another? So the communication is done through expressways or nerve tracts, groups of processes from various cell bodies, say hundreds or thousands of cell bodies. Nerve processes coming out from there travel from one area to the other. And there are actually 3 types of nerve fibers depending on from where to where they connect. Okay. So the 3 types are commissural fibers connect the 2 hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. Association fibers connect areas within one hemisphere, and projection fibers project to and from the cortex, which means projection fibers get information from other parts of the brain, like the thalamus, subthalamus. They are other areas. And we'll talk about these projection fibers in a bit. Now things get slightly complicated because this gray matter area is not a single layer of cells. Along evolution, we have actually started multiplying, like a cake, the number of, multi-layered cakes, those fancy cakes nowadays that we see a lot on those Facebook pages and all, everybody's baking nowadays. Well, okay, so those multi-layered cake-like structure is present in the human cortex. In the human cortex, well, actually in the mouse cortex also, but at least there will be 6 cellular layers. That means 6 cell body containing layers will be present. As you see, named in Roman numericals, 1 to 6. So imagine this gray area is actually consisting of 6 layers. And not only does it receive information from various other areas like brainstem modulatory systems, other cortical areas from the thalamus, it receives inputs to say layer 4 or layers 5 and 6. It also gives out information. That is, you do this, it instructs the body that you do this, or you move your hand, you go towards this sweet sauce, you go towards the fridge, to take the chocolate you want to. So all these instructions are going out through the other to the other cortical areas or other cortical areas in the opposite hemisphere or subcortical structures. Remember the deep nuclei, we saw within the brain, within the white matter, it sends out information there also. Now, why do we care about projection fibers? Because as I said, for example, if you take the example of the frontal lobe is the one which was most evolved. Along evolution, it was seen that the frontal lobe became the largest, as compared to the rest of the brain. And therefore, even if it becomes large, if it has a lot of number of cells, so what? Unless it communicates, unless it receives information from other parts of the brain, there is no point in becoming larger or having more number of cells than, say, ape. Okay. You also have to increase the complexity of the information or the amount of information that you're receiving. And that information can only be enhanced when you have a super highway, like imagine in a city where within the city you have a lot of commotion and, like traffic jams, regular traffic jams. So you create highways around the city so that people can take an exit from somewhere near his house and travel along the highway and reach his destination fast rather than traveling within the city. So as and when the city grows, the highways and all this have grown with the city in any, developing or developed country. Similarly, in a developing primate, an evolving primate, these highways have increased to increase the communication or to increase the speed of communication and the complexity, that is how these highways have been developed, have also changed over evolution. And I will just, sort of this neuroanatomical lecture, I will end with a little interesting note in relation to evolution, that it has been seen that the human brain size have become larger over its own evolution, starting from from the Australopithecus africanus, the first, so-called hominid, and human type of ape, which first developed away from the New World monkeys. So first came up Australopithecus africanus, which was like 4 million years ago. And this is the cranial capacity, which means the brain box, the bone outside the brain has also expanded to include your brain, inside. So that has increased over time. So the cranial capacity has increased as the human being evolved, right from Australopithecus africanus to Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and finally Homo sapiens. There is one deviation though. The Neanderthals, even though they came before the Homo sapiens, they actually had a bigger brain. But what is interesting about this here, say like everybody knows this, but what has been studied by anthropologists and archaeologists is that along with this increase in the cranial capacity, there has been a gradual increase in the, or should I say, the finesse with which the instruments that they used for hunting have become more better, and they have become more evolved. So as you see, from the early Paleolithic, which was about the Homo habilis, from the middle Paleolithic and to the late Paleolithic, from here to here, this was very crude, that instrument, or the carved stone. That this instrument has become much more finer as they progress to the late Paleolithic. And scientists say that this is the mark of evolution of cognition, the intelligence. Okay. So that was one thing. This was about neuroanatomy. This was about the evolution of the human brain. And I'll take a 1 minute gap here. And if you have any questions, you can ask about what we have covered so far.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Ma'am? Yes.
Ma'am, I wanted to ask that I have read somewhere that we only use 5% of our brains. Why is that so? Why don't we exceed the limit of using our brain percentage of?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Why? Well, I can't say why do we use it. Okay. But one thing I'll tell you, I think it's also our requirement. Okay. Our requirement, if it suffices with that 5%. All right. The requirement of learning or requirement of gaining new information, storing new information, etc. If it has sufficed with 5%, we are continuing with it. We are just not expanding our capacity. But if we say learn more new language, that same person who is using 5% is learning more new languages, learning a new technique, if he or she has the time, then for all we know, we actually use more of the circuits of our brain, right? So it is not always that, yes, we are using 5%, but we are capable of using more. All right.
Yes,
our brain capacity. Yeah.
Can I add one point to this?
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. So, this like in the previous century, so in the newspapers also they popularized the idea that Einstein uses this % of the brain, and like other people this % of the brain. But as neuroimaging came and other neuroscience techniques developed, so we came that like everybody uses 100% of the brain. It's just they're like in what ways the person is thinking, and also this like 5% and 10%. Yeah, maybe Einstein used 15% of the brain. So that was from the time when neuroscience wasn't much developed in imaging techniques and other stuff.
Right, exactly. And exactly, you're right. How did they measure it, right? With that time, they didn't have the tools to, like an fMRI, for example, during doing a task. Okay. Yeah. So that percentage wasn't measured. It was a very rough estimate of whatever, like the way the tools they're using. And it's not comparable to what we do nowadays. And in fact, it's getting even better. So today, standing here 10 years later, it might be an even more evolved tool. Okay. So therefore, we do not know how much percentage is actually being used. But one thing I would, as I said, with time, with practice, if you wish to engage, this only shows that you can engage more of your circuits in some activity. Okay. So, and also one thing, this is a very interesting point, because in neuropsychiatry, for example, it doesn't mean that because many of your nerves or tracts are firing, they are transmitting information. That doesn't always mean that using the brain necessarily makes you smarter. Okay. Like using more of your neural circuits generally makes you smarter. Why? It doesn't necessarily make you smarter. Why? Because sometimes, as I'll show you, the thalamus does. The thalamus is a subcortical structure. It's a diencephalic structure. And so the thalamus, what is its function? It actually helps to restrict information. It acts like a filter, and and it doesn't allow all sensory information that is coming from the periphery to go up to the brain. And if it did so, we would have a lot of what, if you see in schizophrenia, like things like hallucinations, like delusions. A lot of this has come from unfiltered sensory information reaching, unnecessary information reaching our upper or cortical areas. And therefore, that might in turn lead to a lot of neurons firing. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it is a very effective output. Basically, a schizophrenic, for example, is getting a lot of information feed. Okay, but that doesn't make that person necessarily a very productive person per se. If used in a productive way, that is like you're learning a new subject, you're learning a new music instrument, that is of course very thus effectively being put into use. The number of, you know, or your percentage of neurons which are doing a productive, have a productive output is good. But as compared to a person who is, say, has been diagnosed with schizophrenia, for example. So I guess no more questions. Everybody is good with neuroanatomy, or anybody else has anything?
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay, who should go first?
Yeah, Rishika, please ask.
I don't know.
Okay. So if I remember correctly, I think the Homo sapiens brain size is it's small. I mean, brain volume is smaller than Neanderthals. So
Yes.
how is that theory interpreting human intelligence? Because modern man is considered more intelligent than like the primitive.
Right.
So
Right, exactly.
Is it
So
about the forebrain, or
see,
what is it?
Right. So therefore, I was talking, I didn't want to get too much into detail about the cognition chapter here, which I've taught the NSCs. What is happening is the whole brain here I'm showing the whole cranial capacity. But what has happened, there is another piece of data which shows that the frontal part of the brain has evolved more than the other parts proportionately. So in case of the Neanderthals as compared to the Homo sapiens, the Neanderthal prefrontal areas or the frontal areas didn't develop as much as the frontal as compared to the rest, in proportion to the rest of the brain as it did in the Homo sapiens. Okay, so there's a further divide. So in the evolution, it has been seen that the frontal area divides disproportionately, forms a larger area disproportionately than the other areas of the cerebral cortex. And as we all know, the frontal is one of the main areas which processes complex information about cognition. All right, is that clear, Rishika?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So today the main point, we were talking about sugar. So we're going to talk first about the main structure, which is the thalamus, and I'm going to show you what a developing thalamus looks like. And you know, when mice are conceived, after that you start counting their date of birth. For example, if it is conceived today, tomorrow will be, after 24 hours, you call it embryonic day 1, or you call it embryonic day 2, the second day, and so on and so forth. And at embryonic day 18 or 19, 18 or 19, they generally give birth, the mouse mother. Okay. So embryonic day 12 means 12 days after conception. What we took was, we took a mouse brain and we cut it coronally. Remember, a coronal section, and we were interested in the thalamus, and we started to look in the thalamus. This is what is called an immunostaining. Whatever you see on the right hand side of the figure is a section, a coronal section, which has been immunostained, put in antibodies to detect particular protein expressions there. And these antibodies which have been used are PAX6. PAX6 antibody means an antibody which a protein which recognizes another protein. And the second protein has a fluorescent tag which says hi to you when you put it under a confocal microscope. So you can see like red, you know, that's the fluorescent tag here. That is showing the expression of PAX6 protein in these particular brain areas. Green, as you see here, is the expression of GFP. Now, what is GFP? GFP is called green fluorescent protein. Green fluorescent protein, as many of you might know, was first identified in the jellyfish in the seas. And it has it seemed to have a bioluminescence, you know, it was color, it was emitting color. And so therefore they identified that as the gene which encodes for this protein as GFP. And why is it interesting and very important? Because this gene can be placed. It is not found in humans and mice and all, but this gene can be inserted into, say, the mouse chromosome or our chromosome if there was some mad scientist there trying it out. So it was if it's inserted into our chromosome, then it would start to express the GFP protein. And when you took a section of my brain or the mouse brain which has GFP and put it under a microscope, you would see green color coming from there. So that is GFP. And GFP equal to GBX2, what does that mean? Here what we have done is we have created a transgenic animal, a transgenic mouse, which will express this GFP gene under what? Under the promoter of a transcription factor, which is GBX2. What does transcription factor do? Transcription factor is a protein which is expressed inside the cell, and it binds to certain DNA sequences which are called promoters. Then why is it called a promoter? Because it promotes gene expression, or it promotes the transcription or formation of RNA from the locus where which it is located upstream of. So now imagine we have the GBX2 promoter. We take out the GBX2 endogenous normal gene and instead put GFP gene here. What we have done, we have created a transgenic GFP mouse which will express green fluorescence, but where? Only in those cells where GBX2 promoter is active. By active, what do I mean? Active means only those cells which have proteins binding to the promoter and activating mRNA transcription. Not all cells do that, because gene expression is generally very specific to specific groups of cells. Okay. So now here we see that. And why did I tag GFP? Why did I put in GFP in the GBX2 promoter? Because we unfortunately didn't have a GBX2 antibody. And therefore, we couldn't tag the GBX2 protein directly. So instead of what we did, that we had a GFP antibody. So what we did is we put a GFP gene under the GBX2 promoter. So cells which will have the GBX2 promoter active will express GFP. And any cell which is GFP positive will be cells that express GBX2. So we saw that GBX2 is expressed in a group of cells in the thalamus. Okay. And then what did we do? We wanted to, our original or initial question about GBX2 was that if we do not have GBX2, then what happens? If we do not have GBX2, that means I created a GBX2 mutant mice. What do you mean by creating a mutant mice? We took out the GBX2 gene. I already told you, we took out the GBX2 gene and put in GFP there. So of course it's a mutant. It will not express GBX2 protein. So it will not have any transcription factor called GBX2. But in the same cells, it will continue to express GFP. And this is like a not take-home knowledge that GBX2 transcription factor is expressed in the developing thalamus, which includes my thalamus, which includes the mouse thalamus. It is expressed in both types of thalamus. Okay. Now you see the figure here. This is a section, a coronal section, which shows the mouse thalamus, which expresses GBX2 because it's green. And from there are these axon projections coming out. And if you remember, I had told you that the thalamus relays information from the thalamus cells to the cortex. Via what? Via the projection fibers. So these are actually the initial beginnings of the projection fibers which come out from the thalamus. These are the highways or the neuronal tracts. Okay. Now what happens in the GBX2 mutant? When you do not have the GBX2 mutant, well, you do have some going in here, some of the projections like this, but you also have quite a few of the projections going up, you know, into another unknown, weird territory, which normally doesn't happen in this case. The region above the thalamus is called the habenula or HP. That's another interesting structure, but let's not complicate it with more information. So the neurons go up here. Now, if you do a higher magnification, what does that mean? You do take a closer look at this area. There's a certain difference. You can see the fibers, the neuronal fibers cross from here to here in the mutant, but it doesn't happen so in the wild type. The other thing which happens, and which you should note here, is that in the cortical plate, what is the cortical plate? See, the fibers are going from the thalamus to the cortex. While it goes in the cortex, remember the cortical area we were talking about consists of 6 layers and all. This is the cortical area and this is the projection fiber. Once it goes there, very few axons travel up. This is called the pile surface. There are very few axons in the wild type which travel up. But in the mutant, what happens, as you see here, a lot of stray axons travel here and there. A lot of stray axons travel here and there. And this is the summary figure. They call it a summary figure, as this consists of all the different aberrations, aberrant projections that was seen in the GBX2 mutant. The last aberration that was seen, that was instead of going upwards like it normally does in the control cortex, a lot of these projections also came downwards towards a very important area called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the area, which is very primitive, unlike the cortex, which is newer form. The hypothalamus is involved in a lot of functions like appetite, temperature, sexual function, hormone regulations, etc. It forms a key center. Okay. So therefore, it was seen that there's a lot of thalamic axons, green axons, coming downwards towards the thalamus. So there are three defects that was noticed in the GBX2. And one thing which we can conclude from these two diagrams is definitely there were a lot of aberrant things happening in the GBX2 mutant. Okay, and this is seen more clearly here. If you notice, this is a later stage embryo, embryonic day 16, where the projections, instead of going to the cortex, see the nice thalamocortical projections in the control. This is background here, and there you see a lot of these green projections going towards the epithalamus or the habenula. Now, what happens here? What happens is what we did was later, we actually went back and compared our mutant, what we say defect or phenotype. Many of you must be knowing what a phenotype is. Phenotype is what defect is apparent from the outside. So that phenotype was similar in the literature to something else, some other mouse that was in some other lab. And that mouse was a robo mutant, ROBO mutant. Now you ask me, what is robo? Robo is a receptor protein which is expressed on the surface of these green axons that I just showed you, these green projection fibers. So what does robo do? Robo sits as a receptor on the surface of these green axons, and surrounding the robo receptor in the immediate environment, in the extracellular environment where the axons move, there is a lot of ligands or chemicals sitting around. There are very specific chemicals called SLIT, S-L-I-T, SLIT, which recognize robo and bind to it. The moment it binds to it, what happens is the green axons that was originally supposed to go up do not go there anymore, they come down. Okay. So they are repelled when SLIT ligand binds to robo. And that is the function of the robo receptor. Okay. And they bind to a ligand, and this is called a chemorepellent function. Chemorepellent, why? Because it repels when it binds to that ligand and it moves away. So the green axon will now move away from the source of the ligand or the chemical there. Okay. And what we saw was people had made robo mutants in mice. Like we had taken out the GBX2 gene to make a GBX2 mutant. Similarly, they had taken out the robo gene to make a robo mutant. And what they showed, by placing a dye, a colored dye in the thalamus, they also tried to trace their axons. They didn't have green GFP lines like us. They put a colored dye in the thalamic cells and then they traced the axons here. Simply, this is the wild type, plus means wild type. From the thalamus, it's going up here. Whereas in the double mutant, ROBO1 and ROBO2 are members of the same family of receptors containing mutations. So this is ROBO1, ROBO2, double mutants. And there was very less axons. You see the intensity is very less here. That means there were very few axons, and whatever was there was traveling ventrally. Look at the schematic here. These axons are mostly traveling ventrally, which is similar to the GBX2 mutant defect that I had shown earlier. We do a thing like here, we compare the two mutants and show that it is a similar phenotype. So robo phenotype or robo defect of going downwards is similar to the GBX2 mutant where the axons go downwards. So therefore we ask ourselves, because GBX2 is a gene, is a protein which regulates transcription of genes, it's a transcription factor. So does it regulate the transcription of ROBO1 and ROBO2? Why do I say that? Because you can imagine if you have a GBX2 protein controlling ROBO1, ROBO2 protein, there can be two different mutants. One, in the GBX2 mutant, I see, say, A phenotype. And in the ROBO1, ROBO2 mutant, I also see the A phenotype. Therefore, it is possible that GBX2 is actually regulating ROBO1, ROBO2. That is to say, in a slightly complicated manner, that the phenotype that we see in the GBX2 mutant, that is going down, the axons going down, this is a phenotype or a defect. That phenotype is because of lack of expression of ROBO1, ROBO2. Therefore, why? Because in the ROBO1, ROBO2 mutant also we see a similar going down phenotype as like the GBX2 mutant. So what would we do next? We would next look at what is the expression of ROBO1 and ROBO2 genes in the GBX2 mutant. Okay, and what did we find? I'll just skip this. We found, this is a technique called RNA in situ hybridization. For time's sake, I will skip this, but if you want me to, you can ask me what is in situ hybridization. This is basically detecting mRNA expression within a cell. And whatever color you see here, it means these cells are expressing that particular mRNA. For example, the thalamic domain here is expressing ROBO1 in the control. Control means wild type. In the GBX2 mutant, there is an upregulation or a ectopic expression of ROBO1. You see here it's not expressed, but it's expressed in the GBX2 mutant here. In the ROBO2 case, the ROBO2 expression, GBX2 mutant, however, downregulates ROBO2 expression as we might have expected. So as you see here, ROBO binds to SLIT, and this is the, I was telling you, ROBO is a receptor which is sitting on the membrane of the green axons, and it recognizes a chemical which is SLIT. SLIT binds to ROBO, and the axons, the thalamocortical axons, get repelled from there. So we had two results. One was ROBO1 was upregulated, the other was ROBO2 was downregulated. But we actually had hypothesized that because GBX2 defect and ROBO defect were similar, therefore ideally our idea was GBX2 mutation or lack of GBX2 would cause a no expression of ROBO or ROBO1 or ROBO2. However, what did we see? Yes, certainly there was no expression of ROBO2 in the GBX2 mutant. That means GBX2 successfully downregulated ROBO2 expression. But in these cells, ROBO1 expression was upregulated. So how do we express the, how do we reconcile this? How do we bring the two phenotypes close together? In order to do that, we had to get in a sugar. And that sugar is, sorry, just one sec, sorry. Let me just skip this. So my question is, what compromises? So my hypothesis now slightly changed. We said that yes, ROBO1 was being highly expressed in the GBX2 mutant, like I showed in the previous slide. However, its function of binding to its ligand or chemical was being compromised, so that in spite of being expressed, it is not functioning properly. So at the same time, we found out in literature, there were certain sugar polymers called heparin sulfate proteoglycans or HSPGs, which help to increase the interaction of SLIT and ROBO. Okay, so if you didn't have HSPG, people have independently shown that SLIT and ROBO do not interact that well. Remember, SLIT is a protein, ROBO is a protein. So if they do not interact that well, they will obviously not be repelled. Okay, So our idea was, yes, Robo1 was still being, the gene was expressed, mRNA was being formed, protein was being formed, but functionally its interaction with the slit was being compromised. Why? Because there might be something wrong with the polymers, sugar polymers, that helps to bind or make the friendship stronger between Robo and slit. So what did we find? So before going into that, I'll just tell you a little bit about what heparin sulfate proteoglycans are. As I said, they are a polymer. Polymer of what? Well, they consist of carbohydrate residues of, it's a dimer formed of N-acetyl glucosamine and also glucuronic acid. Glucuronic acid can later be modified to iduronic acid, but glucosamine and glucuronic acid together form a disaccharide which keeps on multiplying with the help of enzymes, and they form this entire chain. Why is it blue and white here, blue and black here? Because certain domains of this chain are undergo post-translational modification. What happens in post-translational modifications? Various sugars have sulfate groups attached to them. So these sugar polymers get sulfated at various places, either at the 2 ortho position or at the 6 ortho position. Okay, so these little dots that you see here are the sulfation groups there. And as a result of that, you form a heparin sulfate proteoglycan because they are sulfated. Okay, and this sulfation, as I'll just show you, are very important for the proper functioning or the ability of this HSPG to allow slit and Robo binding. If they do not bind, what will happen is no repulsion happens, and therefore the axons go here and there, like what you saw in the GBX2 mutant. So because this is about students, so I wanted to introduce you to one more thing which you might already have studied about, is a thing which we do, which is called RNA sequencing or next generation sequencing. It's a type of next generation sequencing, and where typically what happens is we understand the transcriptome or the mRNA pool or the identity of the various thousands, billions of mRNA that are expressed within a cell. So how does that happen in the lab? How do we detect the mRNAs? One thing I showed you, in situ hybridization, which means on the section with color, we are able to detect the expression. But this happens in the test tube, what I'm showing you here. So a poly A tail is there in most complete mRNAs, right? So you capture it with the help of a polymer, poly T tail. And then what happens is RNA is broken down, that is fragmented, and consists of added to a short primer, to which first strand cDNA or complementary DNA, you all know, is synthesized. Then a second strand of cDNA is synthesized to make it a double strand. Then the ends are trimmed, 5' ends are repaired, 3' ends are adenylated, and then DNA, you have to sequence it like a DNA sequence, So you basically sequencing double-stranded cDNAs. Here DNA sequencing adapters are ligated, and then these are PCR amplified. After this, what happens? This, mind you, this is the entire, there is not one RNA like this. There are billions of RNA sitting around in the cell, right? So therefore, each has unique tags attached to it. And when you sequence it, you will get a library. You create a cDNA, PCR library, from where this known sequences, they are compared to a genome which is already existing, like I say, example, a mouse genome. You compare to the existing mouse genome, and then you figure out that how the various genes might have arisen. Like you can know that, okay, this particular, because how will you know otherwise which sequence equal to which mRNA? So from a mouse genomic library, you are able to understand what types or what is the type of mRNA sequence you have picked up in your sequence, and then you get a list of these are the mRNAs. You go for enrichment, and so these are the mRNAs which are enrichedly or greatly expressed in the cell or lowly expressed in the cell. Okay, so that is the RNA sequencing. And finally, GBX2, what we saw was GBX2 regulates the expression of heparin 6-O-sulfate transferase isoforms in the developing thalamus. Remember, I told you GBX2 must be regulating the HSPG. How does it regulate? It regulates those enzymes which are important for causing changes in the sulfation patterns of HSPGs. How do we see it? We see it by analyzing our RNA sequencing data. What do we sequence? We sequenced our wild type thalamic cells, which has GBX2. We sequenced our mutant thalamic cells, which didn't have GBX2. And we compared gene expression within the two. And what we found out significantly, if you see here, these are the fragments per kilo base millions per read in a logarithmic inverse scale. And what we found out, as you see, there is a significant reduction of the expression of 3 isoforms of heparin 6 sulfotransferase 1. Okay, heparin sulfate 6 sulfotransferase 1. That means the enzyme which adds the sulfate molecule, sulfate at the moiety at the 6th ortho position is not present, or in our very low levels in the GBX2 mutant. So basically, GBX2 is regulating the transcription of HS6ST group of enzymes. And this has been shown by our traditional in situ, as we said on a slide, HS6ST1 expression here in the thalamus. It is much significantly downregulated in the GBX2 mutant. HS6ST2 expression again is missing in the GBX2 mutant. So that is one of the major findings of our paper, which is under, in preparation actually right now. And before I proceed, I would like to ask, do I have more time or this is it? Should I stop here? Anybody?
Yes, ma'am, you can continue.
Okay. So I'll show you just some of the major findings then. So, so we found out that GBX2 regulates the expression of certain enzymes that do what? They actually change the sulfation patterns of these sugars. They change the sulfation patterns, and GBX2 is the transcription factor, is regulating them. So before I move on, because since I already interrupted once, I will ask any of you have any more questions on this, because I said a lot of things. Any questions? Yes. Yes, please.
Did you use any techniques like optogenetics or anything to see the expressions of these?
Why would I need optogenetics to see the expression? Because if you use simple techniques like in situ or antibody staining, you will see the expression, or you do a qPCR, right?
Okay.
Right. Because see, whenever you make a tool, optogenetics is not a cheap experiment. It's quite an expensive experiment, because you need the right microscope to be able to image it also. All right, which is tagged with the microscope, tools which are tagged along with the microscope. Optogenetics is typically something which I would like to use in a live animal, and you're seeing the immediate change, like a change within a millisecond or a second, like something like calcium changes level in the calcium calcium levels, then an optogenetic makes sense. But right now the gene expression, as I'm saying, doesn't change in a second. It's not activity, right? So therefore it's static. It's dynamic, of course. Okay, if you consider over one day, over 24 hours, it's dynamic, but over few hours it is static. So therefore, in such a case, activating a gene expression or inactivating a gene expression over that minimum period of time is not necessary for my experimental purpose. All right. Is that clear?
Optogenetics would be used in real time, like if you want to track a particular activity.
Yeah. Generally, for example, I'm seeing this is very much used in calcium imaging also, right? Like I want to see whether this thing, or when you give a drug, that's used a lot. When you give a drug, administer a drug to the animal, and immediately want to see the changes in the say calcium levels or potassium levels or whatever, and therefore you turn on the gene which is the enzyme responsible for that. All right. So for longer periods of time, that is not a very useful experiment, or unnecessary, I would say, right? You can just see immunostaining or qPCR. qPCR also you can do over short periods of time. over like say 6 hours and see if there's a dynamic. If the protein's dynamic nature, is considerably very highly dynamic. But in this case, in my case, GBX2 is such a transcription factor. It is not one of those essential transcription factors which will change its expression just based on one stimulus. So this is a slowly acting transcription factor, or a very maintenance type of transcription factor, we can say that. All right.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess no more questions. I can proceed. Okay. So we did another interesting experiment, which is called an explant experiment. What does an explant mean? Remember the thalamus we had there? You just take out the thalamus and you plate it on a cell. On a dish. You plate it on a dish and you have the medium, cell growth medium in the dish and all. And you will see, like you see here in the wild type, this is the wild type, and we have put a red color inside the thalamus, this is a wild type thalamus, that's why it's written WT, and which has neurites. These are thalamic neurites. So these are neurons, so they are thalamic neurons, and they are extended, like a spider. So all throughout their periphery. What is this green? This green group of cells is called COS cells. It's a cell line which is now artificially, so we have transfected or put GFP inside them, and they express GFP, and it is nothing else. Now, in the same condition, this is a wild type thalamus. Look at this. These are neurites only on one direction, and it doesn't have any neurites towards this green group of cells. Why? Because these green group of cells are now transfected not with GFP alone, but also with SLIT1, which is a repellent, a chemorepellent. So therefore, the axon processes are repelled away from the direction of the chemorepellent. Whereas, now what is DKO? DKO means double knockout. HS6ST1, remember that enzyme which we spoke about, which was, whose expression was downregulated in our RNA-seq. We took mice mutants of HS6ST1 and HS6ST2. That is to say, these mice are double knockout. They do not express either of those sulfating enzymes. Now, this double knockout thalamus was there, and here was the green group of cells expressing what? Nothing but control GFP. That means nothing should happen. Okay. So all the neurites were like what? Like the wild type, also coming towards the green cells. However, when we put SLIT1, we should have expressed a repulsion. We should have expected a repulsion. Instead of that, in the double knockout, there was no repulsion. That is, there was a loss of responsiveness or loss of chemorepulsion when there was SLIT, even in spite of SLIT being present in the environment, in spite of chemorepellent being present in the environment, there was no repulsion. So what happens is, when you do not have these two enzymes, 6ST1 and 6ST2, you do not have any response to SLIT. That is, you do not have any repulsion. And that is what is shown here. We have also done experiments with SLIT2, where we have done ratios of, what did we do here? We actually put this we divided this into two areas. Proximal is towards green, distal is away from green. And we calculated the relative ratio of the neurites in the proximal quadrant versus the distal quadrant. And what we saw was, when you had only GFP, there was no favorable side. It was coming both proximally and both distally, okay, the neurites. However, in the mutant, what happened in the wild type, when there was SLIT2 present, in the wild type, as expected, there was repulsion. Okay, so it was only the proximal was very less. There were no neurites in the proximal, only distal side was there. Okay, but in the double mutant, it became almost like the control wild type, because there was no sense of repulsion. They didn't understand that the chemorepellent was there and we need to move away. So the neurites kept moving towards the green areas too. So in the double mutant, there was a loss of chemorepulsion. Okay, that means to say that chemorepulsion happens when the receptor, ROBO, sitting on these red neurites, will recognize SLIT, which is coming from the green cells. If HSPG is not sulfated properly, it will not let the SLIT to recognize, allow SLIT to recognize ROBO properly, and therefore no proper chemorepulsion will take place. So the sugars are intervening, and therefore the non-sugary neurons are not feeling the chemorepulsion. All right. Now, what happens in these double mutant thalamocortical axons? See here, this is a control which has GFP. GFP is shown in white here to help you understand the contrast. Yes, yes.
In the previous slide, so are those real images or?
Yes, yes. These are images from the culture dish.
So what is the imaging mechanism also in the previous slide? So all those images, so how exactly they are taken?
Confocal. We use a confocal scope. We put this on. So what we do is these are actually fixed as to say, I've done the experiment and a couple of days later, I will take them and put paraformaldehyde medium, replace the culture medium, put paraformaldehyde on them, and then put these, we'll pick up these explants from the cover slip and put that cover slip, on a slide, and then put another cover slip on them, and then image them in the confocal microscope. That is for this. And those brain sections that you said, these are fluorescent images, and fluorescent images are best taken at high resolution with only a confocal.
Okay. All right. So they are also like cultured in some sense, or like how that works? The brain imaging.
Sorry.
How those? So in the slits, so what exactly is put in case of brain imaging? So the brain section had in the previous slide.
Oh, the brain I cut. I was telling you the various planes of orientation, right? So I'll cut accordingly. The brain, we have a cutting, we call it a microtome or a cryostat. It cuts the brain.
Okay.
And then we put the brain on a slide and we do our staining, or red, blue, whatever, We do the staining and then we'll put a cover slip on it and go to the microscope and image it. That's it.
Okay.
Okay. Now see, this is a control which only expresses GFP. Okay. This one expresses GFP, like GBX2 and everything is normal here, but it doesn't express HS6ST1, which means it's HS6ST1 null, single mutation, single mutant. This is HS6ST2 single mutant. This one is HS6ST1 2 double mutant. What happens is, notice here, this is the coronal section of the cortex, this area where the thalamocortical axon should be going. What we see here is, in the control, it's normal green axons, similar, somewhat less probably, but it's still there in the single mutant. In the HS6ST2 mutant, it is there, but you will notice the cortex seems to be slightly fatter. That's the phenotype or defect that we notice. This is the cortex. And it seems very much reduced and thinned out, and very less thalamocortical axons in the double mutant. Also, if you look at this area, the area in which the thalamocortical axons come out, there are axons, a lot of axons here in the control, in the single mutant, slightly less in the single S2 mutant, but there is no axons in the double mutant. Okay. So that means when we do not have ST1, ST2, you have no axons which go to the cortex, literally. Okay. Now, I'll just skip this because it might be slightly bit difficult for you. Okay, I'll show you this experiment. This one, what we did was, now remember ST1, ST2 mutant have no axons which are going to the cortex. So we also showed in the GBX2 mutant, if you remember my very first slide, we showed that axons are going upwards. The green axons are going upwards. We used a chemical called chlorate. Chlorate, actually, remember I told you about the polymers of heparin sulfate? It chops up the polymers. Okay, it just totally destroys the polymer structure. So a chlorate, and when I add chlorate in dish to the brain, which is there in the dish, if I add chlorate, it will act like a total loss of function of heparin sulfate. Okay, so therefore what we found that there were aberrant axons going up in the presence of the control. The GFP positive axons are going up in the chlorate. Okay, Similarly, if you mark them as, like look at in the green channel, they are going up. That means they are aberrant. But in the control, you don't see axons. This is just the outline, so ignore that. But in the control, you see there is bunch of axons, which normally as it should be, they are going down. So complete removal of HSPGs create dorsally projected neurons in the control thalamus. That just shows that the GBX2 mutant defect that we see, an aberrant projection of axons, might be somewhat created by lack of HSPG function. Okay. And finally, I'll show you this. This has been done in collaboration with a biophysicist. So we did molecular dynamic simulation after docking. What does that mean? We have three molecules here. We have the slit, we have the robo, and here we have the HSPG, which interacts with the two. So then, since there are two proteins and one proteoglycan or a carbohydrate polymer attached to a core protein, so what is the dynamics? What will your prediction be? The prediction based on our phenotypes will be the dynamics of or interaction of slit to robo will not be that efficient if there is no proper HSPG. That will be the prediction based on whatever I saw earlier. How do you do dynamic simulation? You have an initial atomic model that you build. Then you calculate the molecular forces which are acting on each individual atom. Then move each atom according to that forces and see what is the kinetics. You basically calculate the kinetics. Okay. So simply in layman language, there are various energy subtypes which are involved in the interaction of these three molecules. Yes.
This was done in modeler, like protein modeler.
Yes. And finally, from first we dock it and then we go for MD. Okay. So what we found, this is entirely in silico.
Okay.
Yeah. So loss, what we saw was there are various energy subtypes like van der Waals energy. You guys know better than me likely about this. Electrostatic energy, polar solvation, and etc. etc. Okay. So just ignore the minus here. Look at the figure, the numbers between the control values, which mean only slit, robo, and normal heparin sulfate. And here are the mutant values of slit, robo, and 6 heparin sulfate without 6 ortho, because that was the 6 ortho sulfation, because that was the type of mutants we were working with. And so there was an increase in the mutant, decrease in the values. Look at the absolute values, 150, it has become 0.007, 3910, it has become 1353. Okay, so we can discuss about this in detail, but what I want to show you more interestingly is what happened was if we look at each atom moving around, in that entire plane, in the 3D plane with respect to slit, robo, and heparin sulfate proteoglycan, there was a great deal of more jumping around of the slit, robo, and heparin sulfate mutant, which is shown here by root mean square division with respect to the simulation time, which was in nanoseconds. And we saw that you see this red is basically has more of, that band. Okay, it's the range through which this root mean of square deviation is going. The deviation is more for the red as compared to the green. So you see more of red up basically. Okay. So that means the mutant complex is jumping up and more, the atoms in the complex. That means they adopt a less stable and more flexible conformation, which is somewhat shown in the earlier time during the run for the radial, when you calculate the GAIDI of movement of these atoms. And then you see in the initial beginning, there is a lot of instability. So the mutant complex has a lot of instability and flexibility in terms of its movement. And this also shows in another figure when we calculate in the entire 3D plane, how much do they move. So the mutant complex covers a larger area of conformational space. This red is the mutant complex, which covers more space than the green, which is the control situation. So overall, from a simple layman perspective, I am not a biophysicist. This is left to my biophysicist collaborators to write it up. But lack of 6 orthosulfation in HS moiety causes the loss of stability, increased flexibility, and subsequently loss of function of the protein triad. Well, I shouldn't, this is a misnomer. Protein triad is not the correct thing. It's a protein diad with a proteoglycan partner. Okay. So therefore, combined with our in vivo and in silico results, we can very confidently say a few things. One is loss of ST1/2 partially phenocopies the axonal guidance defects of GBX2 mutant, like they don't reach the cortex. Okay. And a subpopulation of the thalamocortical phenotypic thalamocortical axons are directed towards the hypothalamus. What is the unique phenotype? That unlike the GBX2, their axons are reduced in numbers towards the cortex. And I didn't show you this little piece of data, but axon bundles from the beginning, from the initial part, from the thalamus are shifted laterally. So what we can see is genetically, is in epistasis, you know, what controls what. GBX2 downregulates ROBO1 expression, GBX2 induces ROBO2, and it also induces ST1, 6ST123 expression, which in turn controls HSPG, proteoglycan, post-translational modification. And these three together control the full, not only the expression pattern, but also how they will interact, how ROBO-SLIT and HSPG interact. So at the end of the day, if you do not have GBX2, these functions will not happen, and therefore there will be compromise in the ROBO-SLIT HSPG binding. So one of our perceived project ideas is to look at how is GBX2 the master regulator of multiple HSPG mediated signaling pathways in the thalamus. Okay. So that brings me to the end of my story, and this is a very, very old picture. But since this was a takeoff of an earlier PhD project, which was started by me in my PhD lab in Professor James Wiley's lab in Yukon, US. And so my acknowledgements to his lab, of course. And Dr. Vijay Kumar and Dr. Amrish had generated the in silico data that you saw here. And I'll take questions.
Ma'am, what are the like neurophysiological diseases related with GBX2 mutations?
That's an interesting thing, because not much is known, except for the fact that nothing is known in the thalamus for that matter, or people haven't looked. Okay. What is known is if you GBX2 mutation in humans can cause a cerebellar defect. Cerebellum is the organ responsible for movement. So if you do not have GBX2, there is cerebellar defects, but thalamic defects in the humans have not been looked into yet. But HSPG, and that is my interest area, HSPGs have quite a lot of significance in relevance to human disease, because if you do not have proper, as I said, post-translational modifications of HSPGs, or if you do not have a polymerizing enzyme in the humans, it is known to cause autism-like behavior in humans, like neurodevelopmental disorder, autism. And and ROBO1, ROBO2 has also been associated with causing autism-like phenotype in humans. So these three are the downstream are associated, but GBX2 loss, you know why they haven't seen? Because GBX2 mutants, if you take out both, because we are two alleles, right? Now, if you take out both the alleles of GBX2 mutant, they don't survive, because something to do with the respiratory tract and the erythropoiesis. So GBX2 mutants do not survive post-birth. So that is why probably you don't see a GBX2 mutant in humans. Full mutant, I mean, like a null mutant.
Okay.
Yep.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
Ma'am, in earlier slides, you mentioned that in previous time there was an increase in cranial capacity, but nowadays it is being observed that it is decreasing. Can you tell the reasons behind that?
Nowadays it's observed it's decreasing. No. Neanderthals had more of cranial capacity than Homo sapiens. Okay. Neanderthals had more of cranial capacity than Homo sapiens. That is one aberration which was found to the hypothesis that with as evolution progressed, cranial capacity increased, because Neanderthals are certainly not as cognitively intelligent as humans. But in spite of having a big cranium, how did they manage to have less cognition? That was the whole riddle Okay. But in our case, our cranial capacity has not increased. Maybe it has increased, but it has not decreased. What has increased is our relative frontal lobe area has increased as compared to the rest of the brain. Okay. Got my point, Shakshi?
Okay, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So, ma'am, in the tracks you were showing before, so how exactly they are studied? So the pathways, how exactly we know if the exact pathway from one particular section of the brain?
That's an interesting point. See, I showed you. Remember, you saw only one green tract, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Now the green tract is there. Remember, on the side you saw a lot of blue tissue because labeled with certain blue marker. That blue tissue has a lot of other tracts, but you're not seeing those tracts in the section, right? Why are you seeing only the green? Because the thalamic axons are labeled green by genetics, right? Only GBX2 expressing thalamic axons will be green. Now, GBX2 is expressed nowhere else in the brain except in the cerebellum again. Okay. So, only green cells will be found in the cerebellum and the thalamus. Now, whatever comes out of the thalamus will always be green in these animals. So, you are only labeling the thalamocortical tracts. So, that is one way of labeling the, that is one way of labeling. These are genetic labeling. That is, you put the GFP inside a cell which expresses a unique marker like GBX2. GBX2, you find out a gene which is only expressed in that particular organ. In this case, GBX2 is the only gene. Therefore, you label GBX2. That is one way of labeling. Is that clear?
Yeah.
How to label? The second way is you put a dye. I mentioned you in my one of the figures. I'll just show you. Earlier on, it's there. In this figure, you see this orangish thing. This is what's happening. This is a dye. A crystal is being put in the thalamic cells, by surgical implantation. You put it in the thalamic cells, and only those cells like the thalamocortical axons will be labeled. Why? Because only the thalamic cells have that dye. Therefore, they label the cells. So this is a way of tracing neurons. You do that. This is a very commonly used technique.
Dye and labeling, so the marking, so it just proliferates to other similar cell regions?
No, it spreads. It doesn't proliferate. These cells do not divide. These cells do not divide. These are projections, and it jumps from one neuron to the other. These dyes.
So how these dyes are just like limited to those particular, why they spread only to those particular cells and not neighboring ones?
That's a good point. This dye eye, it's called, is somewhat spreads to adjacent cells also. It's not always limited, but because initially you put that little crystal in the thalamic area, okay, so it will be contained within the cell body initially of those group of neurons, and it will travel down the long process and then go to another nuclei or another axon. Okay. It therefore doesn't, as long, and remember, mostly what you're seeing here is a single nerve tract. They actually do not synapse here. Where will these axons synapse? They will synapse at the cortex. So at the cortex level, when they reach the cortex, I'll show you a picture here. See this? So they have come outside from this green area, and they will go totally upwards. And once they are top, where you see the red arrow, they are going to synapse there. So that's the point where they'll contact with another neuron. But this whole process, they are only one axon tract. They are not synapsing. So that means once the dye has reached the cell body, is within the cell body, it will travel within the process, right? Right. Got the point. But you're right, because it can diffuse to surrounding cells. So labeling cell genetically, like in this case, GFP is only labeling the cells which are expressing GBX2. So those cells are only GFP positive, and the other cells will never be GFP positive until unless they express GBX2. Genetic labeling is always a better way of labeling cells than using dyes. Clear? All right. I guess we are done. Everybody's very silent.
Ma'am, there was one question in one of the registration forms. What is the scope of this in abroad as a master's subject?
Sorry. Can you repeat it? Your voice got choppy. Masters I heard, but before that I didn't hear.
What is the scope of this abroad as a master's subject? Yes.
Okay. I guess he or she is referring to neuroscience, you know. So neuroscience, developmental neurobiology. So basically, neuroscience has a lot of scope nowadays, especially considering the work and the burden of population who have neuropsychiatric disorders is huge. Okay. So people who do neuroscience can go into academia, like do a PhD after you do a master's. Of course, with master's alone, you cannot join and like research. You cannot have a lab of your own. You need to do a PhD, and then you can join, become a professor and do your own research, either teaching or professorship. The other thing is in master's level only, say you do a BSc in neuroscience like our university has, but there are very few places which do BSc in neuroscience, I guess. So MSc in neuroscience, if I'm assuming, if you do, you can actually go for a PhD in neuroscience and then go for academia. Or you can go into industry if you have the proper internship. You do good industry related internships from MSc. Many industries take you up to do research. Okay. And one more thing which has come up a lot these days is scientific writing. You can go into writing, editing industry. You can also go into life science consultants. Many of the big companies like TCS and all have life science consultancies on their side, which act as like sort of bridges between the pharma company and the consumer, so that you explain the technical scientific aspects of them to the salespeople and create good ideas for them, like for example, selling a vaccine at this point is an example. So another thing is clinical psychology. Many people, a few of our students have also gone, they do clinical psychology after that. Either you do a MSc in clinical psychology or you do a PhD in clinical psychology. You can do somewhat of like a neuroscience or neuropsychology for your master's. Then you can become a practicing clinical psychologist as well. So there is academia, there is practicing, like a clinical psychologist, or you can be in industry. So as we see from our students only itself, there's a lot of scope there. Okay. Yep. Does that answer, Swanza, the question?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, cool.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Bye.
you, ma'am.